بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم and alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Brothers and sisters and friends, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Today we're going to be discussing no God, no good. What do we mean by this? It's basically God's existence, and we're arguing from objective morality. So what are we really talking about today? Well, this is a summary of today's discussion, brothers and sisters and friends. If morals, our sense of right and wrong, is objective, it necessitates the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if you really believe that killing an innocent 5-year-old is objectively morally wrong, then Allah must exist. Let me explain. But before I do that, let's explain what we're not saying, because it's very important. Because some people think, are you trying to say that as an atheist I can't be a good person? No, we're not saying that at all. Some atheists display very good morals. We're not saying that. So let me give you some examples of what we're not saying. Number one, we are not saying you can't be an atheist and display good or moral behavior. We are not saying you have to believe in God to be moral and to have moral traits like defending the innocent and feeding the poor. We are not saying just by being a believer you will have good behavior. Of course not, because there are many believers who don't have good behavior, of course. What are we saying? But what we are saying is if Allah doesn't exist, then there are no objective moral values. Moral values such as murdering innocent people for entertainment is wrong and defending the innocent is good. They would just become mere moral conventions like picking your nose and flicking it at the dinner table, right? And that's what it is without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's just like saying it's wrong to burp or to pass some wind in front of your mother-in-law, right? Well, some mother-in-laws are quite tolerant, but that's a different discussion. So this is what we're saying. We're saying you can't claim objectivity to your morals, whether you think something is morally good or morally evil, without the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, why? Why are we saying you can't have objective morals without the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because think about it. The concept of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that He is objective. He transcends the universe. He can make the universal moral claim. And also, He is the only concept that transcends human subjectivity, the only anchor point that we can anchor off and leverage off to claim the objective good or the objective evil. But as you know, there are some possible contentions. Some people say, well, maybe biology is the basis for our objectivity. Maybe social pressure, people coming together and agreeing, is the objective basis for objective morals, whether good or bad. Other people claim moral realism, which we're going to discuss later. But I think it's very important now to discuss what do we mean by objective? What do I mean by objective? What we mean by objective, brothers and sisters and friends, is that it's not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering or representing moral facts. And it's not dependent on the individual mind just for its existence. So in the context of morality, that our morals are not just based on our personal feelings or experiences or opinions, and not just based on one's own individual mind. It exists outside. That's why, if that's the case, these morals require some kind of grounding. How do they exist outside of the mind? What grounds them to be objective? And that's very important. So let me just give you some examples of what we mean by objective. If the whole world agreed to the fact that eating a dead person is a good thing to do, it would still be a bad thing to do. If the whole world, brothers and sisters and friends, claimed that it was morally okay to kill an innocent person, it would still be immoral and abhorrent. If the whole world, brothers and sisters and friends, claimed that it was morally good to set up unjust trade agreements with Africa, it would still be unjust. So you're getting the point here. We don't care what people think. It's bad. because it's objectively bad, outside of the individual human mind or its collective experiences and collective subjective opinions. That's what's objective. It's outside of the human mind and experience and personal feelings. And if that's the case, if they are objective, then they require some kind of grounding. Now, this doesn't mean they're absolute, okay? Because some morals can change based on moral variables, right? So we're not saying they're absolute, that in every instance, this thing has to be wrong. Because sometimes killing someone is not always wrong, is it? Obviously, it's wrong if they're innocent, but if you have to defend your nation, for example, when an oppressor comes to fight you, then you may have to do that. And that becomes now morally good. So I don't need to confuse absolute with objective. Absolute would mean that killing in any instance, in any type of variable circumstance, it's always going to be wrong. No, that's absolutism. We believe in objectivity, that concerning the moral factors and variables, this particular moral deed, act, or thing is actually objective. It means that it transcends our human subjectivity. Okay? So don't conflate, don't misrepresent objectivity by thinking it's absolute. Absolute means that this particular act, for example, killing someone or killing in general, is always going to be wrong regardless of any variables, time, place, scenario, situation. No, we're not saying this. We're saying, given a certain situation, when we come to the conclusion that something is evil or good, and that evil or good is objective. It means it transcends our human subjectivity. It's outside of the mind of the human being and the personal experiences and feelings of the human being. That's what we mean by objective. And it doesn't mean absolute, that this particular act, regardless of any context, is always going to be wrong. There is a slight difference. And it is no wonder Professor of Theology Ian Markham, he says the following. He says, embedded in the word ought is the sense of a moral fact transcending our life and world. The underlying character of moral language implies something universal and something external. And what Professor Markham is actually trying to say here is that, yes, we do have this sense of objectivity. Why is it that in a given situation, if a certain person is innocent, that killing him will be objectively morally wrong? Why do I have that ought, that sense of gut feeling that is objectively morally wrong, regardless of what people tell me? It's because morals are objective. And that's the point. And if there are objectives, then it can only be explained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because what grounds them, if they're outside of the human mind, human experience, and human personal feelings and opinions, what grounds them, what makes them objective? It can only be Allah, because Allah is the only concept that transcends human subjectivity. And interestingly, we have an interesting, it doesn't matter. Anyway, you got used to me by now. Interestingly, we have a very interesting opinion from atheists. For example, J.L. Mackie, in his book Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong, he says the following: there are no objective values. The claim that values are not objective, are not part of the fabric, and let me just say that again. The claim that values are not objective, are not part of the fabric of the world, is meant to include not only moral goodness, which might be most naturally equated to moral value, but also other things that could be more loosely called moral values or disvalues: rightness and wrongness, duty, obligation, and actions being rotten and contemptible, and so on. So essentially what J.L. Mackie is saying here, the moral philosopher, the atheist, he's being quite honest, because he believed there is no God, so therefore there can't be any objective moral values. He was going against that kind of hardcore intuition that human beings believe that killing an innocent human being is morally wrong regardless of what people tell us. And again, Professor Ian Markham says something interesting about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best explanation to ground these moral values, to make them objective. He writes, God explains the mysterious ought pressing down our lives. God explains the universal nature of the moral claim, as God is outside of the world. God the Creator can be both external and make universal commands. So from this perspective, what other concept grounds morals and makes them objective? There is none. But some people claim biology. They say, well, maybe biology is a basis for objective moral values. Well, listen to what Charles Darwin said in his book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, published in the 19th century. he gives an extreme example of what it means for morals to be based on biology, and it's quite interesting. He says, if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. This is a problem. Because if we're just a reaction to social biological conditioning, then our morals are not objective, because morals are contingent, dependent on biological changes. So if we, for example, evolved like the nurse shark according to the same conditions, we will think it's morally okay to rape our women. Because the nurse shark, apparently, according to National Geographic, if my memory serves me, is that they force themselves and they wrestle on their mate, which is tantamount to rape. So how can we just be a reaction to biological conditioning? It doesn't really make our morals objective. It is no wonder, brothers and sisters and friends, Professor Michael Rules, who's also an atheist, he says, morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth. I appreciate that when somebody says love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they're referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. It is no wonder, brothers and sisters and friends, one of the four neo-atheist horsemen, Professor Daniel Dennett, he said the following. He said that human rights from a Darwinian biological perspective is nonsense on stilts. Because how are they binding an objective? What grounds them to make them objective? Biology can't be a basis because it changes. And it has no meaning because it's just a reaction to biological conditioning. Some people now argue, what about natural selection? Maybe natural selection can be a basis for moral objectivity. And we'll discuss this further in the next episode. Bi-idhnillah.